so many.
Okay, thank you for coming back, and we will have our second panel starting very soon. All right, we will start, and I think people will just coming back after they finish the chat. Thank you very much for coming to the second panel, and after a very comprehensive and very intriguing discussion about the shift of the global paradigms, we are going to go a little bit deeper on specific issues relating to oil, and specifically in China and also relations with U.S. My name is Wang Tao, or you can call me Tao. I'm a resident scholar at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center based in Beijing. And same as Matt, it's our pleasure to be here in our home, meeting with you. I will give you a very general introduction about our panelists in a second, but just to give you an overview of what we're going to talk in this panel, we will focus on the environmental implications of the oil production and consumptions in China and try to find out some of the linkage with U.S. as well. I will be covering on the issue of consumption of a particular substance that will have relationship with China's air pollution. And then beside me, Debbie will talk about the carbon climate change perspective of the oil. And then we have Scott to talk about the water. And then finally, my colleague Stephen Livingston will wrap up and talk about the other trends in the China's oil consumptions and also policy instruments. So without further ado, let me just introduce you our panel. Debbie, you already met. Deborah Gordon is the director of the Carnegie Energy and Climate Program, and her research focuses on oil and climate change issues in North America globally. And we are also very pleased to introduce you Scott Moore, which is now research fellow at the Council on the Foreign Relations, but at the same time he's research fellow at the Belfer Center and the Harvard Universities. I met him when he was in China, when he was doing water-related issues, and it would be very nice to hear his insight to bring this together with oil. And then last but not least is Stephen Livingston, which is an associate in the Carnegie Energy and Climate Program, and his research focuses on trade, markets, and risks. And he used to work in WTO and in Geneva, and also served as an advisor to the director of the Energy and Climate Change branch of the United Nations Industrial Development Organizations. So without further ado, I will just introduce you my latest research on the Petcoke, or otherwise known as petroleum coke. It's a byproduct of the refineries, and you will see how this is actually impacting the air pollution issues in China. It's not moving again. Okay. It's not really working. Okay, good. So generally speaking, you all know that the air pollution is coming from the three main sources in China: the power plants and the vehicles and factories. And because of that, Chinese government has come out with very ambitious plan to reduce the carbon coke consumptions, especially. So this is a general target of reducing the coke consumption in the areas surrounding Beijing and also other parts of China. And you can see some of the targets are really radical. For example, Beijing is about 50% cut from the 2012 level in 5 years, and Hebei, Tianjin. And they are, in terms of absolute term, is also very large. But then, because of all this, we start to looking at the potential of the implications on the industries, and then we found something very interesting. This is a general trend of the U.S. export to China of the petroleum coke. It's picked up very slowly in the early of this decade, but then after 2008, which is coincidentally the peak of price of the Chinese coal, it jumped to very high level. So now it's about 7 million tons of the export to China. And that is the number probably you will like to compare with the numbers here. Later we will talk about it. So basically now we import about 7 million tons of the petcoke from U.S. every year in China. The latest number for 2014 is slightly peaking, so around the kind of plateau in the next year, but still it's around the 7 to 8 million tons. And it's not only to China. U.S. actually exports this petcoke to various countries, to Japan and to China. And China is the largest share in terms of single country destination, and also Mexico, India. And you will see apart from Japan, most of them are actually developing countries. And that raises the questions how this is being used in those developing countries and what it means. In general, this part to Japan is slightly different, which we will go to later. But you will see the difference of the usage of the petcoke in different countries. So what it is? It's a very unknown byproduct of petroleum coke, and it comes out of the refineries, and many people don't really come across it until quite late. When I'm asking this substance to the industry people in China, many of them, even though their industries are using them, the people in the association or even in the policy side in charge of that are not really aware of this, or at least not knowing how much their consumption of this. So in general terms, petcoke is basically a co-substitute, used as co-substitute in those developing countries. It comes out with the byproducts of the refineries, and it actually contains much higher purity of the coal, 92% or even more in some of the cases. So what it comes out with, the petcoke has higher sulfur content. Usually, when we talk about a fuel-grade petcoke, is higher than 3% in terms of the sulfur content in it. In comparison, if you look at the coal exported to China from U.S., the sulfur content should not be higher than 2%. And the average production of the Chinese coal, even the ash atoms, ash content are higher, they shouldn't be higher than 1% in terms of sulfur. So basically, this is much higher in terms of sulfur content, and we know that sulfur dioxide is the major contribution, one of the major contributions to the air pollution. The highest I come across in Shanghai from the refineries, state-owned refinery, is 7% of the sulfur content. And then also high in the heavy metals, and it's, but on the other hand, because it's very high in terms of the coal or carbon content, it has higher thermal value than coal. And also because of the other reasons, it becomes much cheaper in the international market. So it makes them ideal substitute to the coal when the coal is difficult to get. And there are huge developing countries' demand on this, and the U.S. is exporting to them. And usually this is also interesting. The heavier the crude, the more you will get of the petcoke, because then related to the processing, you will have more residues of the oil fed into the delayed coking unit, which generating the petcoke. And also the dirtier, especially the unconventional oils, come out when they have higher sulfur content, heavy metals, other impurities. You will have higher impurities of the petcoke, because that is basically everything else will remain at the end and the residue. So everything valuable will be taken away, and then the dirty part leaves in the petcoke as the final byproduct to be burned. And also it has higher carbon footprint, not only because it has higher carbon inside compared with coal, but also because of the unconventional oil and also the processing process implies much higher carbon footprint than general coal. So basically you can think this is something difficult to be treated. Most of the refineries take it as invaluable byproduct. They try to remove it, so they can afford quite a lower price for selling it because they already got the cost covered by selling their liquids. But then it's also difficult to move around, and once you produce it, you have to find a way to deal with it. And the usual usage for that also relates to what we talk about, the 11% export to Japan. When you have the higher grade, which is lower, much lower in terms of sulfur, it calls the anode grade petcoke. It's used in the metal industry, such as steel, aluminums. They will be using to producing those metals. They're not supposed to be burned, and they require much higher quality and purity of the petcoke. So that is a high-value product. But what we have is 80% of that is petcoke production now is the fuel-grade petcoke because of the higher content of the sulfur and other things. So basically we got more and more what we call the fuel grade, and that is alternative to coal used in more and more in the developing countries. And of course, China itself is the second largest capacity in terms of refinery, so we also produce a lot ourselves. So if you look at this, we only, also mind you, petcoke is not even in China's statistic yearbook until 2010. So we don't really look at this as a specific categories in the statistics until quite lately. So we only managed to get the data from 2011 and 2013 in the Chinese official data, and that is the total consumption. You can see it's still increasing in terms of petcoke, and the import is also increasing. There is also quite interesting the local refineries. Those are not the state-owned enterprises. Those are the local private refineries, usually small and large number and usually poor in terms of performance and equipment. Most of them concentrated in the Shandong province, which is also one of the source of the smokes. And they are still increasing, and they use very, very different kind of feedstocks as generating petcoke. And then you can see the largest is, of course, Sinopec, because it's the refinery capacity of the Chinese state-owned capacity. The consumption of it, which is very interesting, you can say is half of them is used in the aluminum industries in China, even still. Sorry for the Chinese, I haven't got time to translate this, but this is aluminum, and this is the fuel grade. So basically, you're talking about no more than 1/3 of the consumption in the fuel grade. But in fact, we also find out in this, as you have more of the higher sulfur petcoke, they start to release the sulfur dioxide during the whole process. And also because of the increased impurity of this, there is also the tendency of that will consume more of that as an anode, but the anode wouldn't be lasting very long because of the impurity. And then what are you going to do with also this anode after use? I don't know, because there is no statistics, and also people are not really willing to share information, but I did find there is already online sales of the used anode as an alternative for coal. So people can actually buy them, even though they're just anodes. They're not called even petcoke. So you can use it. So basically, there is what we're talking about, a potential leakage of, while Chinese government is trying very hard to reduce the coal consumption, but there is a kind of like alternative things coming out unintentionally to replace the place of coal. And more worse, we don't even know this place, this stuff, and there is no requirement even in some of the industries for their sulfur dioxide emissions. But also there is good news. How it's been burned would matter, because if you use what they call the circulating fluidized bed boilers, which is the kind of standard equipment in most of the refineries in Chinese, state-owned Chinese industries, you will be able to quite effectively and cheaply remove the sulfur dioxide. And the good news for that is the Sinopec, which is the largest Chinese refinery state-owned enterprises. Some of those refineries equipped with CFB, and all of that petcoke produced in there will be used for the CFB to generate the heat and steam for their own use, but they cannot use all of that. So they will still have to find a place to sell them out to the external users. And for the external users, we cannot. They probably will be most likely the smaller industry use, and they will just use as coal in other client or pulverized coal boilers, and we cannot guarantee the sulfur dioxide and other issues being taken care of. So what we need really is to look at how this is actually matters for China's policy. We come out with 4 suggestions. First is still improve the statistics, and we know we have to enforce more strength in the monitoring. And secondly, this thing existence is actually reflect to the deficiencies of the policy control, of the command and control approach of the policies. When you target coal, you didn't expect that it will come out with alternatives. So what we need to do is to implement more of the economic instrument to correct the price mechanism, so that people are not either you're using coal or petcoke or other alternative fuels, you're going to pay for the price, you're going to pay for the emissions you cause, rather than just complying with the coal targets. That is the current targets we have in China, which of course cause this give the open window for the unintended petcoke consumption surge. And also, we still have to produce a lot of them, because China is still going to refine a lot of crude, and we have to make sure that we burn properly, use CFB and other alternative technologies, and treat and remove the sulfur dioxide before they emit it. And the fourth one is actually there is possibility to change the process of the refinery, and you will be able to reduce the production of the petcoke at the end, because that is still something we can remove from the production, and that will also release the pressure. So I'll give you a very brief presentation of this petcoke, and to let you know that we are finalizing a draft on this research, and it should be finished by end of this year, and will be out next year. It will be very great to have your feedbacks on that. Thank you very much. And I'll hand this to Debbie.
Thank you, Tao. So the petcoke is a story of an unintended consequence, a byproduct of oil. Oil is Oil is changing, as we've discussed, and what's fascinating and what I'm working on is an oil climate index, looking at a much higher level than the tail end of, say, a petroleum product like Petcoke, but looking in response to what the world just witnessed with President Xi and President Obama agreeing to climate cooperation. And as climate talks open today in Lima, what does this mean for oil? You know, oil is often not the first thing that's mentioned in a climate realm, although there's a certain realization that cars and oil are a big part of this problem. And as these two nations with the world's largest oil appetite are sensing some agreement here, it actually means a lot for oil, a tremendous amount for oil. Just which oils will the U.S. and China consume? And that's the work that I'm working on. It turns out that there's a growing array. We've seen this over the last 5 years of very diverse global oils. Some are solid and more like coal. Some are very gaseous. Some produce a lot of petcoke. Some are trapped in shale. Some are near depletion and need a lot of force to get them out of the ground. There are very different hydrocarbons in the earth, and the only thing they have in common is the fact that they have hydrogen and carbon. Everything else about some of these oils is quite different. So we have a lot of choices here. These differences lead to very different climate impacts. And what I struggle with all the time is the use of the word oil in a climate context, as if oil is one thing, as if oil has one set of impacts. Even when you get down to the next level, when you hear oil sands or tar sands, there are so many different types of oil sands and tar sands. So there's a tremendous amount of diversity in these now at $100 a barrel, as Michael was saying. We have sheer abundance of resources and a lot of choices with profound climate impacts between them. So all oils are not created equal, especially where climate change is concerned. So to address this issue of the diversification of oil as we're entering into an era of climate cooperation, most hopefully coming out of Lima and with what China and the U.S. have been talking about, it's to compare these global oils to one another in terms of their total greenhouse gas emissions, in a true way of looking at the entire value chain, which no one has done before. There's been more and more work on what they call the upstream. What are the greenhouse gas emissions associated with getting these oils out of the ground? But we can't forget that these oils then need to be, once extracted, these hydrocarbons get transported and refined or otherwise processed, depending on what they are. And then they have to go to end use. And these oils make a very different array of petroleum products, as we just heard. Some make no petcoke, some make a lot of petcoke, some make a lot of petrochemical feedstock. The very light end in the natural gas liquids that come out of these oils that aren't even burned. They're put into petrochemicals, which are an air pollution issue, maybe a water issue, but they're not a climate issue. They're not combusted. So these oils not only are they different, are they extracted differently, are they refined differently, but they make different products that add up to very different climate impacts. So when you put all of those forces together in this value chain, you get very different greenhouse gas emissions for oils. We have a sample of 28 oils that we've run through the models, and there's an 80% difference, 80. Almost a doubling of difference between what's the lower climate impact oil in its totality and what's a higher climate impact oil. So in addition to using less oil to resolve climate impacts, it's choosing wisely as to which oils we'll use and how we manage them that are going to have very large impacts. The categories for the higher emission oils are a couple of kind of summary points at this point that we know of, that extra heavy oils, bitumens, oils that just are heavy oils to begin with, they just have more carbon than hydrogen, and in large measure that's China's oils. China's oils tend to be heavier oils, and then the oil shales, the kerrigans that China also has, the U.S. has as well in the Rocky Mountains, those tend to be on the high end, the 80%, the higher greenhouse gas emissions. Very depleted oils that need a lot of steam and assistance to lift them out of the ground. Those oils, there's very little left of them in the reservoir, but the desire is to get everything out. We get better technologically. It needs a lot of energy in to get a barrel of oil out. Those tend to be higher greenhouse gas emission oils. Gassy oils are a big problem. We're seeing this in North Dakota. We're also seeing it. One of our highest test oils was Boshang offshore China. The reason why it was so high in greenhouse gas emissions is it's a very gassy oil, which means there's a lot of natural gas associated with that oil in the reservoir. But if you don't have gas handling capacity where you are when you're producing, you flare or burn the natural gas because the oil is worth so much compared to the natural gas. You end up burning it, which means a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. So you might take an otherwise pretty simple oil but has a lot of gas, handle it improperly, and end up being a very big footprint of greenhouse gas emissions. So those are some of the reasons why these oils kind of start to segregate themselves. But we're looking into the details of where these greenhouse gases are actually hidden in this value chain as we manage oils. So China and the U.S., as the two largest oil consumers right now on Earth, are going to have to choose wisely. The Oil Climate Index is going to be an incredibly useful tool to illuminate a path forward for both of these countries, which oils they want to produce or which they want to leave in the ground, which oils to import. You know, if there was actually this decision that goes along with the economics of oil, the geopolitical aspects of oil, but the climate impacts of oil, you'd have a triad of decision-making triangulation where you can actually think about how do you reduce greenhouse gases as you're deciding which oils to import. Which refining techniques to employ, as Tao was talking about. Some refineries have a lot of improvements to make. The teapot refineries in China are a particular example of a problem where there's a lot of energy input. In some cases, you might not even get as much energy out as you get energy in, but you've still converted this energy to a value, so you continue to do this work in these inefficient refineries. And then ending my comments where Tao just ended, which is what petroleum products come out. How to use those petroleum products like Petcoke will be very important decisions. So just to let you know where this project is, Carnegie is working with Stanford and the University of Calgary. We're developing two models. An upstream model that's largely been developed right now, open source, called OpG, that models the greenhouse gas emissions from extracting oil. We're now working with Calgary, the University of Calgary, on a refining model, the first open source refining model. So policymakers, investors, the public, think tanks, others can actually understand the refining process because that's what drives all the products that circle the globe in terms of what the oil becomes. And we'll be hosting an Oil Climate Index event in March. So stay tuned for that. But again, the idea here is to understand oil better, understand the differential impacts between oil, because in the end of the day, it's really oil that's replacing oil. That's what we've seen these last 4 years with the high price of oil. It wasn't if the high price of oil brought renewables, biofuels, electrification of vehicles to the market. What it brought was a brand new array of oil. And now it's incumbent upon us to actually get very smart about choosing between all of these oils that we know that we have the technology to bring to the market. Thanks.
Well, thank you. I'm very happy to be here and look forward to some discussion on what I think, and obviously I'm a little biased, is a very important topic. And in fact, I think it's so important that I'd like to just sort of take a moment to sort of step back and reflect on, I think, the fact that we have this panel and me in particular here talking about a water-oil nexus actually represents a fairly profound shift in Chinese policymaking and politics, particularly in the oil sector, the energy policy arena, but even more broadly. So I'm, by background, a comparative political scientist, and although I'm primarily interested in China, I'm always trying to sort of compare and contrast it with other countries. And one thing that I think is very interesting when you do that is that you see that while all countries, all governments have problems coordinating between different policy areas and different parts of the bureaucracy, historically, China has really been notably kind of stovepiped. So you had policy in different areas being made pretty much in isolation, and that except at the very highest levels, there was very little kind of coordination and cooperation and even communication between different ministries and different sort of parts of the Chinese government. So what that meant, of course, is that in the energy policy arena for a very long time, the players that really mattered were the planning bureaucracy, the NDRC, and the state-owned enterprises. And of course now, as we heard this morning quite a bit, the dominant kind of issue for the longest time in this energy policy area of energy security has now been very much broadened and pluralized, and so we now have to think about environmental security, climate issues, and water security, and that's of course what I'll be focusing on. But I just wanted to sort of point out the fact that I think the fact that these are issues of concern really reflects a broader shift. And the other important piece of that is that along with these interests or these issues come different interests. So that energy policy now is basically a set of trade-offs between these different issues and interests. That, of course, also means winners and losers, and unlike in the past in China, both the winners and the losers now have a voice. And that makes these decisions that much more complicated, and you see that especially in the water policy space. So with that kind of background, basically there are two sort of sets of issues when you're looking at the intersection of water and oil or other energy resources as well. The first one of those has to do with water quality, and I thought the best way to sort of illustrate that issue is to compile my own personal greatest hits list of recent oil-related environmental disasters in China that affected water. So 2005, and some of you will of course be familiar with these, but there was a benzene spill from a CNPC facility on the Songhua River in northeast China. About 100 tons of benzene spilled into the river, contaminated the water supply for Harbin, a major northeastern city. 2011, you had actually a series of spills in Bohai Sea off the coast of northeastern China. About 840 kilometers of oil was released as a result of that. Most recently, just a few months ago, a CNPC pipeline leak contaminated the water supply for Lanzhou, another major city in northwestern China, with benzene. Disrupted water supply for this city of about 2.4 million people. So that's not a trivial impact in terms of water quality. And of course, that feeds into a broader kind of political issue in China over pollution. Water is a big part of that, but obviously the air pollution issue and soil and land contamination issues all kind of are part of the politics of this issue. And so this is increasingly something that's very much on the radar of senior Chinese policymakers and leaders. And I just thought in that vein I would mention something which I found very interesting. So last year, Sinopec facility was found to have contaminated the soil and water supply of a small town in Anhui province. Attracted a lot of attention and also attracted a Chinese daily editorial which criticized the combination of power and money that allowed, in other words, collusion between CNPC and local leaders, Sinopec and local leaders, which allowed this to happen. That's a very unusual sort of statement to hear from a state official publication, and I think it illustrates the political resonance of these issues and the extent to which they've really sort of moved up the agenda in a way in which is quite novel. The other side of the water-oil nexus is, of course, water quantity issues and looking at trade-offs between the use of water for oil production versus, of course, other issues. And again, of course, the best illustration of this is in the case of shale oil, where you do have a tremendous sort of tension between exploitation of these reserves to achieve energy security objectives versus water security and environmental protection objectives. Just some numbers, and I should say here I'm quoting from the Carnegie report on this, which is excellent. China has about 32 billion tons of shale oil reserves, which is about 10% of global reserves. If these reserves were to be fully or even maximally exploited, that would, of course, do a tremendous amount to alleviate sort of security of supply concerns, which, again, as discussed this morning, are extremely pressing and prominent in China. But China's shale oil reserves are, for the most part, extremely deep, so greater than 5 kilometers, and in deposits which make them much more energy and water intensive to extract using conventional processes. So I think it's a nice illustration of where you have this real kind of tension and contestation of objectives. Do you want to pursue, or how you balance these new sort of issues, interests, and considerations around environmental protection, around water scarcity versus the much more traditional energy security objectives. So I want to just then say a little bit about some of the kind of responses in terms of policy that these issues of water quality and quantity have provoked or caused in China. So the first of these, a little more generally, are some significant shifts. And again, many of you will be familiar with these in China's environmental protection legislation. We have major revisions to the environmental protection law just early this year and late last year, which significantly tightened enforcement capability, removed limits on fines that can be levied for pollution, including state-owned enterprises, and also permitted the detention for up to 15 days of enterprise bosses who are found to violate pollution legislation. Alongside that, you have some very significant reform of environmental tort provisions, so it's becoming much easier to, although still difficult, to sue both state-owned enterprises as well as foreign joint ventures for pollution incidents. And in fact, you see this becoming an increasingly common thing in the oil sector. In 2007, a Chinese court upheld a judgment of $2.5 million in fines against a Chinese company, actually, a small Chinese subsidiary for a spill in the Bohai Gulf. That's not trivial, especially in China. And of course, in 2011, this attracted some international attention. A Chinese court gave the go-ahead for a $78 million suit against the CNOOC-ConocoPhillips joint venture for Bohai spills. So these political concerns around kind of these tensions between energy security and environmental protection are definitely being reflected kind of in the policy space. With respect to water particularly, there are two significant developments that I thought I would mention. And just sort of by way of contrast, it's sort of relatively well known that China is sort of moving towards an implicit price on carbon throughout the economy. It's less well known that China is doing the same thing for water. In urban areas, China has instituted a tariff reform so that industrial uses of water will pay a higher tariff rate, a significantly higher tariff rate than they currently do. In agricultural and rural areas, there's a water rights trading system that's being put in place, and basically what that means is that there will be, for the first time, a mechanism for transferring water that now is used primarily for agriculture to the energy sector to use for example, energy production of shale oil, and that's a mechanism that didn't exist before, and it's obviously a response to kind of concerns over water quantity and water allocation. So I think in terms of what this means, what all this sort of means for the future of water oil issues, I think that in some ways the picture will become a little bit more like what we've seen for the last few decades here in the United States, where I think you'll see an increasing kind of role of litigation in kind of arbitrating these tensions between increasing oil production in China and trying to address some of the environmental implications. I think in the water space particularly, I'm actually fairly optimistic, and here maybe I'll tread that fine line between optimism and naivete, but I think these policy mechanisms that I mentioned do provide a plausible way to address sort of some of the water scarcity issues that people often talk about, particularly with development of shale oil. And so I think that constraint going sort of toward the medium term will not be as severe as commonly thought. But I do think the enforcement of these more stringent environmental pollution provisions will be a major sort of focal point for tension going forward. And I think that's probably the biggest open question in terms of how China will accommodate the growing concerns over water quality. So just to finish up on that note, I think you have sort of these two issues of quantity and quality in terms of water. I think they're being addressed separately and to different degrees of efficacy, but they are both being addressed, and they will play an increasingly big role, not only in the oil sector in China, but also the energy policy arena more broadly going forward.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Scott. First of all, thanks to everyone for coming out today, for braving the rain, and for joining us today for a very timely discussion. I want to add to everything that's been said this morning by doing two things. First, talking about a trend in Chinese fuel markets that I think is under-recognized but of vital importance in the years ahead. And secondly, to talk about much as Scott just discussed, not only China's water challenges, but the political economy of addressing those challenges. I'd like to discuss a bit the political economy of addressing air quality and climate issues in China's oil and fuel sector. The first thing I'd like to draw out, because I think it's a bit shocking and significant, is that China is currently on pace to become a net petroleum products exporter this year for the first time since these statistics have been recorded and made publicly available. China has oscillated between being a net petroleum products importer and exporter throughout the year, but October marked the largest volume of petroleum product exports, of fuel exports, in China's recorded history, and it marks the fifth such month that China's been a net exporter and not importer. This is largely due to a significant build-out of refining capacity over the past few years. Both large, complex refineries built by China's national oil companies, as well as some of the smaller and more crude teapot refineries, or tea kettle refineries as they're called, which are not owned by the two major national oil companies in China, PetroChina, or CNPC on the one hand, and Sinopec on the other. These two hold a significant market share in China's refining market. About 70% of China's refining capacity is held by these two. But in addition to that, much of the other 30% is made up of these small teapot refineries. What's another trend which is taking place, and one that is contributing to this change in China's fuel import-export balance, is the fact that for the first time, China is beginning to allow some of these teapot refineries to import crude oil as they desire. Traditionally, the import of crude oil has been an implicit monopoly of the two large players, of Sinopec and of CNPC. And as a result, the Chinese teapot refineries have typically resorted to importing heavy fuel oil, as well as at times asphalt or other bituminous mixtures as refinery inputs. So they've had to go to less valuable and much heavier products as the government has given first priority for the import of actual crude to the two large players. Last year, a crude oil import license for approximately 200,000 barrels a day was granted for the teapot refineries, and the government's now considering increasing this to 400,000 barrels a day. As the teapot refineries begin to import more crude oil that's actually a better fit for their particular individual refining configuration, this also means that demand for fuel oil, which was largely imported, is beginning to decline. A significant provider of fuel oil in the past has been Russia, and imports of Russian fuel oil are declining significantly. And in fact, in October, the same month when China's petroleum product exports hit a record, its fuel oil net imports hit a 10-month low of 160,000 million tons, which was compared to 850,000 a year ago. At the same time that China's fuel oil imports are declining and a number of other petroleum product imports are declining, including diesel, due to economic rebalancing and a move away from heavy industry, China's gasoline imports continue to increase, and its gasoline demand continues to increase. This is largely driven by the motorization of China's economy and the movement of middle-class consumers to become purchasers of automobiles, to become family households that see the automobile as a status symbol and as a threshold of achievement and entering into a very stable position in the middle class of a very quickly growing economy. There are now more than just over 300 million motorists in China, compared to a U.S. population of about 320 million people. And China added the last 100 million motorists in only 4 years. And that pace is only continuing to accelerate, which gives you a sense of the scope of the challenge that China has, not only in dealing with the quality or the character and nature of the oil and of the fuels that it's using, but also just the sheer volume of that. And this brings us to the question of what policy options China has, how it's constrained and how it sees its own policy options. I would argue that China's environmental policies to address oil and to address fuels are growing in both scope and ambition, but that they are not going to track completely similarly those same policies which you might see in the United States or Europe. Specifically, I'll discuss how a number of different policy mechanisms are still not correlated directly to carbon intensity, like Debbie's work with the Oil Climate Index is working to develop a better capacity for doing. This is indicative of a number of facts. It's indicative of the multifaceted challenge that China has in reducing oil demand, in addressing local air pollution, and other local environmental impacts, alongside trying to make sure that it meets climate commitments, responsibilities on climate change and on greenhouse gases, such as the pledges that were recently made alongside the United States. So this is it's using a net rather than a scalpel. It's slow encirclement rather than the rapid and direct targeting of individual gases or of individual high carbon oils. And at risk of overusing a cliche, I would say that it's much less a chess game, and it's much more a game of go or wei qi, a game of encirclement, slow. In terms of market mechanisms that China is beginning to use and beginning to make more robust, there was recently, only a week or two ago, an increase in the fuel tax. This increase had been planned for quite some time, or had been prepared quite deliberately a while back, but was only deployed very creatively and very elegantly in response to the recent dip in oil prices that occurred. The largest increase was seen in the prices for middle distillates and fuel oil of about 15 US cents a liter, about 0.95 yuan a liter, which represents about a 17.5% increase. This is much less than the 700% increase that we saw in the year 2009, but it's nonetheless a significant move forward, and as a result, where fuel prices were expected to be adjusted downwards in line with the recent fall in crude prices, they've remained completely consistent over recent weeks. Interesting as well is the fact that the government has announced, the government finance ministry announced that it will use the revenue to combat pollution, address climate change, and improve public health and the environment. So it is explicitly committed, and it'll be interesting to see to what degree the usage of the funds is made transparent, that there are accountability mechanisms, but it is explicitly linked the rise in fuel taxes to environmental policy. The other interesting thing about this is that China collects its fuel taxes differently than other countries do. Typically, fuel taxes are recovered in advance from refiners, who are then expected to, in turn, collect those fuel taxes and pass them on to consumers. Now, typically, this has been very easy because of the vertically integrated monopoly of the major national oil companies in China. And as a result, it's CNPC and Sinopec have been able to pass on fuel prices easily to the consumer, whereas the teapot refineries have typically had to endure and eat some of the fuel price increase because of the fact that prices at the wholesale market are unregulated. So the prices are fixed for sales from Sinopec and CNPC, but not so for teapot refiners. One interesting thing to look out for is the fact that last year, as part of the market reforms that President Xi has introduced, or that he's intimated that are desired for China's oil sector, CNPC has indicated that it is looking into spinning off its retail assets, so its actual retail gasoline fuel stations. And if this were to be the case, and if you were to slowly over time see a disintegration of the vertically integrated national oil companies, it would be interesting to see how the political economy of fuel price increases, and potentially in the future, a national carbon pricing system or a national carbon tax would be passed along. The other major policy market pricing instrument on the horizon that I would raise is the 7 pilot emission trading schemes that China has going on at the moment in both cities and provinces. Of these, only Shenzhen has included transport or transport fuels in any way in its scheme, and that's public transport, which it is recently announced will be included early next year. Shanghai has also looked into integrating some local transport emissions into its scheme, but it very much remains to be seen how, when China moves to a national carbon market in 2015, how it will seek to address the transport sector. When the U.S. When the failed carbon market bill, cap and trade bill in the United States was being considered a number of years ago, most economic analyses showed that the price necessary, the carbon price necessary for inducing fuel switching in the power sector, which will obviously be a key measure of success for any carbon pricing scheme in China, because you're going to need to induce fuel switching from coal to gas or renewables. The price that's necessary to do that is still wholly insufficient to really make an impact on transport demand and to really make an impact on transport emissions. So if China truly wants to have the transport sector play a role in its road to meeting its climate pledge that it made alongside the United States, it will have to think very deeply about how it wishes to address the transport sector, how that sector will be linked to other sectors of the economy, and how it will deal with the shifting political economy and the shifting power structure of the national oil companies within the country and within the country's leadership apparatus. And with that, I'll have some additional comments, but I want everyone to have a chance to be able to ask some questions and for us to have an open discussion, so I look forward to a robust one.
Thank you, David. We will have about 20 minutes for Q&A, and I will open the floor. And I will take 3 questions in the 10 and let our panelists respond. Please raise your hand if you. Gentleman in front.
One way, Ken Meyercord, World Docs. One way to interpret the recent agreement between the United States and China is that China has promised to continue increase its emissions every year for the next 16 years. And their increased use of Petcoke perhaps reflects their dedication to achieving that goal. Have they given any indication what they expect those emissions to be by 2030 when they will be capped?
Okay. Let's take another 2 questions before we. Okay. Just to give you a brief answer, I think, yes, that's one way to look at that. But also another way, in Chinese perspective, that also means we have to slow down their growth very quickly in the next few years. And especially when the economy is still growing and the energy replacement, if you like, or a transition to the renewables and other low-carbon energy still are in the early stage. If you look at the share of the energy consumptions, that is still very low in terms of renewables and hydro. So even many people believe that the 20% of non-fossil fuel energy target by 2030 will be very, very difficult. And I share that sympathy, but I think China can do more of that. And yeah, I think you raised a very important point that we talk about peaking by 2030, but also what matters is where you're going to peak. And especially if you peak very high, that also would not do much great to the climate change issue. And I think that is also an issue that we have to address. And to be honest, I wouldn't be confident enough to give you a prediction or estimate about where we're going to peak. But I think if you look at the transition of or trajectory of the emission growth in China in the last few years, you can say it's already slowed down. And the growth will probably be much lower than most of the scenarios projected than before. And there may be even a much larger landscape change of the China's economy structure that is going to take place in the next few years. And we can account for that for more of the reduction. So anyone wants to okay, let's check.
Maybe y'all can help me a little bit on the pledges business. I think on the U.S. side, we kind of understand administration pledges a result far in the future. You might think he's pledging his best efforts to get that or something, but we all know that the Congress, a lot of other players are involved, and we don't dictate results in our economy. In China, it's been different. I mean, they've had a command economy where they can sort of try to dictate results, GDP results, whatever, and they all seem to, in the planned sense, they can sort of force the result. But how would y'all look at this Xi Jinping, quote, pledge? How does that work through their political system now? I mean, things have changed a lot. Can he really pledge something for the result? Is it for the, 20 years out? In a way, it's a more stable political system, I guess, so maybe they can do that. But I'd like a little bit of discussion of that issue.
Okay. Okay. Gentleman in the middle.
Hi, Doug Vine for C2ES. In the follow-up to the recent climate announcement, there was also an announcement about capping coal consumption by 2020, and I've seen in some think tank reports and other reports about controlling the runaway growth in oil consumption as well. Can anyone point to, or does anyone expect some sort of official announcement with regard to petroleum caps or petroleum consumption growth caps over this period out to 2030?
Okay. Do we have another question? The people on the back. Go on the back, and then we'll take the next round with. Yeah.
Hello. Yeah. My question is, I'm Jihang Zheng from Xinhua News Agency. My question is that now, talking about the climate commitment made by China and the U.S., and but when I see that from the Congress, the Democrats has lost the control of the Congress, and the Republicans has said they want to they don't agree with that climate promise, and so do you think that U.S. can keep that promise to reduce the emissions to 2020? Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone from my panelists wants to address those issues?
I'll maybe say something about the question on sort of credibility of the commitments and pledges made as part of the climate agreement. Before I address that, completely unrelated to your question, it occurred to me that I missed a golden opportunity to say that oil and water don't mix. So I'm saying it now. So the short answer, okay, so yes is the short answer. Mostly is the is the slightly longer answer. The way that so Chinese commitments for in the climate and energy policy arena can, for the most part, be viewed as having credibility. Although there have been major lapses in the past with regard to kind of inventorying and properly accounting for emissions, and that there's a notable incident where basically the clean development mechanism was completely undermined by Chinese companies that artificially ramped up their emissions of HFCs and then were paid subsequently to reduce them. There's been a lot of progress made in what's called as MRV, measurement, reporting, and verification of emissions reductions in the past. A lot of effort has gone into increasing the credibility of that and the capacity for that. Slightly sort of more pessimistic answer is that, I mean, take any environmental policy issue and even going outside the environmental policy arena, anybody will tell you that there's a big gap between what's on paper and then what happens, particularly at the local levels. Again, capacity has been getting considerably better over the last few years. So I would say that substantively, it's not a huge consideration. Now, where I think it will be more of an issue is in the domestic politics of other countries, including ours. I do expect that to be a major kind of focal point for congressional criticism, or at least that's what I would think. I don't follow U.S. politics as closely, but that's sort of what I would pick up on. And I would expect similar criticism to come from other countries in the course of the global negotiations over the next year, concluding in Paris next year.
I can address, I can address the last question on U.S. Congress. I think that it's interesting. I think where the U.S. is somewhat stuck on climate change is now we've been moving, and awareness has been moving. We've been stuck on climate policy for a long time, and I'm under no, illusions that we're straightforward on a path toward robust climate policy making. But on the disagreements we've had for the last over 15, 20 years on whether climate change is real, I think that the U.S. has seen movement there. I think it changed with the Superstorm Sandy. And it's a bit of a bubbling up from mayors, from businesses. I mean, those are voices into the U.S. Congress. So we're seeing more awareness and acceptance of the fact that climate change is a real phenomenon, something that's really troubling and problematic. And very recently, in the last few days, there have been very conservative pundits that are coming out talking about, as David was alluding to, what's happening also in China with the gas tax, where if the price of oil is very low and the U.S. public has gotten used to much higher prices at the pump, and we've seen dramatic drops in gasoline prices that, it's nice for the Christmas season, but everyone has a sense it's not realistic and there's going to be volatility in this market, then maybe some sort of cushioning of this price to stabilize it using a carbon tax as a stabilizing force to keep fuel from vacillating, confusing so many people and not knowing where things are headed. I think that there's a little bit of that's, peeking out. Again, I don't want to overplay it because I'm not sure where this will go, but I think it's finally coming into those types of calls for policy from different strange bedfellows might be coming into a place in America that's a little bit different than we were going into Copenhagen. So this could be a different set of circumstances, both Lima and then into Paris.
Thank you, David.
And I'm happy to address that. It's an interesting question on could we see an oil cap announced similar to a coal cap? I think it's unlikely in the near term, at least over kind of the period of analysis that we're going to look at over the Xi Jinping era, for a couple of reasons. Number one is just the physical differences in the sense that the units of analysis, the objects of analysis being motor vehicles, and automobiles are much more distributed, much more decentralized, and just of a far higher quantity than coal plants. You're talking about thousands of coal plants versus millions of automobile owners. Number two, I think China will probably look at this this fairly precipitous drop in oil prices and the implied volatility therein, and see. Number one, the opportunities to implement policies which have been in the queue for a while, like we discussed earlier. But I think it will also be hesitant. It will make China more hesitant to commit to tie its hands to a particular cap, to a particular specific year or something like that, when those oil prices are very much determine a number of different things. And this actually connects to one of the other questions, which was about the nature of China's commitments. I think we're talking a lot about China's carbon emissions peaking around the year 2030. But there was a secondary pledge, and the other secondary pledge was in the deployment of clean energy. I won't say renewable because it also included a number of other sources in there, but it's kind of clean energy, wind, solar, nuclear pledge, and hydro pledge. And I see the transport sector as actually more relevant to that renewable energy pledge than to the emissions peaking pledge. I think the emissions peaking pledge was largely consistent with already announced or already intimated policies in terms of coal and in the power sector and in the industrial sector. I think the transport sector will be crucial in China actually being able to meet the pledge it made on the share of renewable energy. And so just to give you an example of how important oil prices are in that and why it might make China hesitant to announce a peaking or a cap on oil consumption, if you look at the energy return on capital invested, if you're investing in energy that will be used to power a vehicle, and you look at the efficiency gains that you get with an electric vehicle that displaces oil use, the energy return on capital invested for for investing in oil versus investing in wind is less. You actually have a more favorable investment in wind when oil is at $75 a barrel, and the same holds true for solar when oil is at $100 a barrel. Now, if oil collapses beneath $75 a barrel, where it currently is, and if that happens for a prolonged period of time, you have a situation in which the synergies between deploying electric vehicles and increasing the amount of renewables deployment that China can go about in an economic way, the scope for that is dramatically reduced. So I think actually a great deal hinges on the oil price for China in terms of how the transport sector will fit in with its pledges on both peaking emissions and on deploying renewables. And I would expect them to respond to low oil prices, not by announcing caps, but more so just by continuing to ratchet up the fuel price like we recently saw in the past few weeks.
And let me just use the moderator privileges to add my 2 cents on that. I think one of the advantages for Chinese policy and also political system is that they will be able to plan a much longer time frame than other countries, some of the other countries. And if you just want to have a look back to the example when Premier Wen Jiabao in 2009 announced the targets for 2020, the carbon intensity targets in 2020, you can see there is a huge difference between that government and today's government in terms of where they want to head the economy. But still, that carbon intensity target has been maintained and even intensified to produce even stronger emissions targets. So I believe this is going to continue and will be consistency in the future. And also the process itself, it's not a target that has been raised by Xi Jinping himself. It has been discussed and approved by the political bureau altogether. So there is a strong consistency even for the future government to improve that. And to talk about the oil cap or coal cap, I think there is also interesting point to remind ourselves that given the current situation, and if nothing changed, China still feels very, very uncomfortable about the increase in oil consumption. So there is a lot of incentives, even in the leaderships, trying to slow down the growth of the oil consumption and also the import, because most of the production are already plateaued in China. So we are relying more and more of the import to meet the growth. And for themselves, that is already something on the top of their mind, and then trying to use all sorts of alternative technologies, including, for example, biomass, biofuel, and also electric vehicles, which they invest a huge money to trying to replace the fuels in the transportation sectors. But if there is more confidence built in Chinese government and being integrated better in international energy governance systems or oil system in the future, they might feel more comfortable, and then that may have some negative impact on China's measures controlling the growth of the oil, but which this is another interesting topic for us to discuss. Let's take the probably the last round of the questions. Professor Lee, you just mentioned.
My name is Li Bin, Carnegie Endowment. In China, beside climate change, a more serious concern is air pollution, because air pollution is more visible to everyone. Climate change is a little bit further to most people. It does not seem that the Chinese government really understands the reasons of air pollution. The evidence is that during APEC, the Chinese government tried every approach to stop air pollution. The Chinese government temporarily shut down some factories and controlled the number of vehicles on street. Everything it could think about, then it would try. Apparently, that's not a sustainable policy. It has to find the real reason of air pollution. So my question includes two parts, and is for all panelists. The first part is that, what is your sense about the real source of air pollution? From coal, combustion, or oil, or something else? The first part of the question. The second part of the question is that, how do you suggest the Chinese government to adjust or change its energy policy to deal with air pollution? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, this gentleman in the middle.
Hey, Russell Iser with Leidos. How effective was the government in the response to the benzene spills in Lanzhou and in Harbin and the oil spill in the Bohai Gulf, from your point of view, and also from residents in Lanzhou and Harbin? Was there a grassroots response or some sort of protests that resulted from that?
Do you have a last question? Yes, Mr.
Hi, I'm Keith Benish from the Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy. Just had a question about the implicit price on water. And you'd mentioned that one of the things they were doing was enabling sort of some of the allocation that had gone to agriculture uses for that to be able to be traded or sold off for industrial uses for oil production. I wasn't sure if that was a change. Was that done to protect the water for the agricultural use, right, that could be done, as opposed to enabling, like otherwise they were afraid it would just be taken by the industrial uses? And if there's any more detail you can provide on how that's developing.
Yeah.
I'll start with Liebin's question about climate change, air pollution, and what are the sources of air pollution. It's interesting. I think that it doesn't seem to be lost on people, but maybe it just comes out too simply in the news cycle, because I know that the knowledge is there. Los Angeles had, as most of you know, profound problems with air pollution starting in the 50s and 60s, and spent the last 65, 70 years dealing with this issue. Now, Los Angeles is in a worse position than, say, Beijing is, because it's a warm weather climate. And so the footnote on this is a lot of the air pollution problems are photochemical. So the warmer the climate is, which means climate change, the worse the smog becomes. So climate change and air pollution are already linked, but because there are so many different sources of air pollution, the whole idea of monitoring and reporting and being very good with your knowledge of what's coming, what the regulations have to happen, and enforcing those regulations with very good reporting is something that China is going to have to become very good at, because air pollution is one of those things that you could cut something out, but it's not enough, and then the air pollution continues. The particulate matter, which is a coal and a sulfate problem, is something that isn't photochemical, but it's a physical. When you have sulfates in the air, it's a physical visibility issue, and it makes you feel like you're in kind of under a veil. That's the issue that is related to coal. The car issue, and this also goes with petrochemical plants and just, wood-burning stoves. Anything that's combustion of that sort is a NOx and a hydrocarbon problem, which then photochemically goes to ozone, which is much more of a systemic problem. You're also going to get that sense of a veil in front of your face like Beijing does, but what you're doing also is, with both pollutants, both physically and chemically, you're changing people's health. You're altering the physiology of people, heart disease, lung disease, issues that come with it. But it's a very complicated problem. But I think that China should be extremely heartened by looking at California and saying, there's a way out of this, but it's not going to be easy. But ideally, the way out of air pollution will help with climate change. Solving climate change will then help with air pollution. And what it brings is a much more honest and robust monitoring, verifying, reporting way of practicing. You can get away with something, but everyone's going to pay. If you pollute, everyone's going to feel it, and it's going to be a tragedy of the commons. So I think that there's hope here, but it's not going to be an easy solution.
I'll just pick up on the other two questions quickly. First question about whether the government sort of mounted an effective response to some of these spills that I mentioned. No, not particularly. They represented pretty significant lapses in enforcement capability at the local level, and that again reflects the problem that I mentioned earlier, where you tend to get this big disconnect between central policies and the amount of attention and resources that are devoted to environmental problems at the local level. So it definitely reflects a weakness. However, the government has gotten significantly better at kind of their public response to these issues over time. So they were very much faulted for example, the 2005 incident, as well as the 2011 Bohai spill, which was essentially covered up for, I think it was about 10 days. I can't remember exactly, but a fairly significant length of time, and was widely criticized for that. And just a brief note on that, I respectfully disagree with a kind of thesis that you often hear that some of these environmental pressures are could potentially serve as a catalyst for widespread political protests and things like that. I disagree with that in part because I think the government has gotten significantly better at kind of damage control, and they have sort of read the same articles and things about how environmental issues contributed to Taiwan's democratization and things like that. They've read that history too, and they are very focused on kind of containing discontent around some of these issues. On the allocation question, important clarification. There are parts of China where energy production takes place where water isn't really a limiting factor. Sichuan is a good example. I mean, it's a consideration, but not necessarily a constraint. But most of China's energy production is concentrated in very water-scarce areas in sort of the North China Plain, and that's an important sort of clarification that I didn't make when I was talking about this. And so basically the situation there is that effectively all the water that is usable is already used. And about 60% of that is used for agriculture nationwide, and in the North China, it's closer to 80%. So basically, you just don't have enough water to kind of accommodate demand growth, especially from these new energy uses, without taking it away from agriculture. And that's very difficult because water hasn't historically been priced. There was no mechanism to essentially pay the farmers not to use less water, et cetera, and to say nothing of the political difficulties in harming the peasant interests. So what this kind of new set of policies does is sort of create a semi-market mechanism to facilitate that transfer. And it says that every water use has to be permitted. You get a right to use a certain amount of water, but you have to, that right is, it's limited and it's contingent and it's revocable. So over time, you kind of try to build in some scarcity pricing, so there is an auction component for some of them. So basically the idea behind this policy is just that it creates a way for this reallocation to happen under what's effectively a natural cap on water use. Although, just very briefly, because it is significant here, China is instituting a nationwide cap. And again, it's sort of interesting to think about this as a parallel to the climate change issue and the idea of a cap on greenhouse gases. They're capping total national water use by 2030. To my knowledge, no other country, certainly one as big as China, has tried to do that. And that's a very significant development. And then the idea is that there will be caps at province level, and then that'll be ratcheted down to city, county, et cetera. So increased energy production will have to contend with those with that codification of effectively natural caps on water use. I think that will be a significant issue in the northern, more arid, water-scarce parts of China going forward.
Great, thank you, Scott. And just one point to add. From what I know, the cap of the water doesn't really match with the cap of the emission. Because the energy production and the water consumption, they didn't really talk to each other when they said
that's true.
So there's something to look into. Anyway, on that note, I think we will conclude this morning session. And please join me for a round of applause for our panelists for their wonderful short-time discussions.